Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Joe here, joined by Erica Rex and Mona Sobhani. How are you both doing today?
Good.
Very well, thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Good. Yeah, excited. This is going to be an interesting one, I think, for folks. And Mona, this is our first time meeting, but Erica, you and I go back a few years at least, I think. And so, Erica, I just want to give people a little understanding of your background. So, from what I understand, trial participant at Hopkins, journalist and writer. But could you give us a little background on yourself?
Right. I came to psychedelics way into adulthood, and as a participant in the clinical trial that was run by Roland Griffiths and in Johns Hopkins. That was in 2012. And I started writing about it. I have lots of feelings about therapists, and the way things have gone because of experiences I've had and prior to that. And I saw the possibilities, but I also have had time to observe and consider at great length some of the dangers of these modalities over time. And I think that it's necessary to look at all the possible kaleidoscopic ramifications of how psychedelics work in our lives, including as they become more popular and more accepted, including things like ontological shock, being used in different environments, different people, and it's something that needs to be visited. So that's where I am. Thanks.
Right on. Thank you, Erica. And Mona, you're a clinical psychologist and researcher, but can you give us a bit of background on yourself?
She's not a clinical psychologist.
I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. Yeah, but
there it is.
Close. Yeah, I studied psychopathic traits actually initially, and I was doing digital health research, and I had this existential crisis where everything just started falling apart, and I sort of had this, I guess I call it a spiritual awakening now. And I was very strictly scientific materialist, anti-spirituality, anti-religion before all of this. And then, until crisis comes knocking on your door. And I had some familial, cultural experience with divination and, other transpersonal things like that. And in this time of crisis, I just got curious about it and started reading and interviewing people in the space and just started opening my mind. And it was through those interviews actually that somebody had mentioned to me, I should look at psychedelics because they're really interesting, and that sometimes people, when they take psychedelics, could have transpersonal experiences or paranormal phenomena can happen. And I was super unfamiliar with psychedelics. I had never even thought about them, like really. And then I dove into that literature, and my mind was blown, and I was so impressed with the science. I had no idea that it was like that. So then I started experimenting there and found how healing they were, and that what the person had told me was true, that there's all these really interesting things that happen on psychedelics, but not just psychedelics, right? In any kind of altered state. So I just have this interest in how all of these things intersect because they're all kind of their own separate fields. And of course, I'm a neuroscientist, so I'm interested in how brain and mind and all of that plays together.
I love that. Great. So I want to really dig into this topic of ontological shock, and then I do want to dig into that California study as well, Erica, near the end. Mm-hmm. But let's take it, do either of you have a good definition of ontological shock? Like, what is this concept?
It's you want to start?
Well, I mean, to me, it's just how this is not going to be a technical neuroscientific definition, but to me, it's how you make sense of the world around you, which is reality, right? And our brains actually have a lot of ways to do this, to double check, right? The sensory information that's coming in, our brain's constantly trying to make sense of it. And we have frameworks for that we've picked up along the way from, child development all through our entire lives. So it's taking the information that is coming in and comparing it to that framework. And ontological shock to me is when something along that pathway gets disrupted. Either what's coming in doesn't match the framework, or suddenly the framework is shifting. So that's how I think of it.
It seems like an easy definition here.
Super easy.
The state of being forced to question one's worldview. And that seems like it's inherent in medium to high dose psychedelic sessions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but there's a big difference between the way someone can experience those. There's a very wide range of experiences that accompany how people apprehend what happens to them. And some people, it seems to come in and they are able to do this kind of reframing. It's okay with them. There's something that's not so rigid about the way their set of assumptions or their personalities are structured. And other people, it comes across as an enormous cataclysmic experience in which the world itself and everything they held true and imagined and thought about and experienced is exploded in the course of one session. And so the shock would be more prevalent among that latter group. There seems to be a big difference, although I mean, it's true that people who've had plenty of experiences, I think as Mona has described, and are accepting of them can still have that experience where yet again something even more profound or extreme comes to pass that they haven't experienced previously in those ways.
I could speak to that a little too. So outside of the context of psychedelics, but for me personally, the spiritual awakening or encountering paranormal experiences or whatever, things that according to our Western mainstream scientific culture shouldn't be true when they are true. When I came up against that, it was so threatening to my identity as a scientist, as a very serious scientist. And that's kind of what I was looking at through the whole process. So what Eric saying, it makes so much sense. Like for me, it was so important for me to protect my identity. And maybe for somebody was a little more evolved or had done a little more self-work on themselves, it's less threatening to them. It's easier to accept. And for me, I feel like that's true now that I've gone through it. So I think it kind of depends, I don't know where you are in your, I don't want to say development, but just in your path, So, and then one more thing to add to that is when I went further to actually experience these different realities with psychedelics, it was a whole new layer, a whole new ontological shock of, even though I logically, rationally understood that there might be other realities, or let's say I even believed in some of it, experiencing it is a whole different thing, right? And then that's a whole new kind of shock to like incorporate. And shock is a strong word, but it's an encounter, I guess.
Yeah, like there's a gradient to shock, right?
Yeah.
Not only in terms of like a long-term consequence, but like actual, like how crippled are you?
Right.
We like to say, can you actually afford for your life to get rockier right now?
That's a very good point. Yeah, it really depends where you are on your path and how many other things are unstable, or there's so many factors that go into it. So yeah, it's pretty complicated.
So general question, like, do you think researchers are currently preparing study participants well enough for ontological shock or other kinds of experiences? And if not, what could they do better?
Erica,
from my perspective,
yeah, you probably know. No, I want you to answer because I feel like, yeah.
I think they're doing an abysmal job. And I think they are treating this very much in the tradition of, we are doing the research necessary to get a drug approved by the FDA, and we're going to do so that we can have another pill to prescribe. And it is not accounting for, even though people have framed the results that when people have the spiritual awakening, the depression is usually much more effectively treated, blah, blah, blah. But they're not really coping with what happens the day after somebody leaves the study session, goes back to London, wherever, and then tries to function in their daily lives with, number one, very importantly, that they don't stress enough, is not having the support. When you go through the experience, you have a lot of support. You leave, you go back, those guys are not there. If you're lucky, they'll talk to you on the phone. If you're not lucky, they won't. So you're left kind of on the street with your ontological shock and your need for, what shall I say, verification and someone to bounce this experience off of. And this is what happened. And I think they're not being responsible about it.
Yeah.
The more I think about it, especially as the drug companies get involved, really. Like in France, a very large drug company is running the biggest study now at the big mental hospital in Paris. They basically bought that situation and
Like a Compass or something?
yes,
Or was it?
Compass
Yeah.
explicitly.
Yeah. They've got enough cash to do that for
in
sure.
St. Anne's, the
Right.
gentleman who is the head psychiatrist there is always very eager to be involved with pharmaceutical companies, and he was very happy when the ketamine boys were paying him to prescribe ketamine for depression, and he was approached, and that was it, off and running. So,
Mona, how about yourself? Like, where's the room for improvement here? Or what are the biggest errors in terms of
Yeah.
lack of preparation for studies?
I mean, I don't know what they are doing, but I started wondering about this and kind of musing on it after that. I had a really powerful 5-MeO DMT experience where even though I was really well prepared for it, I came out, like I said, like it's one thing to know what to expect to experience, but it's another thing to experience it. And when I came out, this is my experience, I think, and I'm just one person, but part of the problem is that you don't have, as we all know, we talk about this all the time, you don't have the language to even describe kind of what the problem is, right? And you don't even know if there's a problem at first. At first, when I came out of the experience, my ego was like, no, we're fine, everything's fine. We are fine. And I couldn't, if someone had asked me, which people were asking me, I was like, it was interesting. Like, it was great. I'm processing it. I'm working through it. It's good. But I couldn't, there was no language to explain like what I was experiencing, like how shocking it was to have become the entire universe and to be back at my computer answering emails. Like, if someone had asked me, how do you feel? Like, I didn't have any words. I didn't have language. And even with all the reading and research I had done, there was no framework of understanding and no language to communicate it. And so it took me a really long time to understand, is there a problem here? Or do I need to communicate with someone? It kind of, I didn't even know how to deal with it. And I had support afterward. But like I said, you could have support. And if you don't have the language and the capability of expressing, that relational aspect, if I can't connect with another person, they can't help me. And so there's multiple, I think, steps. Like, there's you connecting with your feeling. There's external frameworks and language maybe you could provide, or other people's stories. Maybe that, if whatever your external support is, kind of, you don't want them to prime you with words or experiences, but in some way help facilitate, I don't know, like being in relationship with the experience in a better way, if that makes sense. I don't know.
So I come from the holotropic graph world, and all of these experiences are done in groups, which isn't necessarily the best case scenario for people with really acute problems. But I do wonder how something like a group therapy could be integrated here in a long-term format to help people get their shit together in the next couple months.
Yeah.
Right? Because this, the next 2 weeks are hard, or it could be longer.
Yeah, I agree. And I did it with a group. It was a small group because I think half the people got COVID and couldn't join. So then it was like me and one other person. So it was supposed to be a bigger group, but it was a small group. But it did really help to have the other person. And the facilitators, of course, had done it and were experienced in it. So we could all talk about it. It definitely helped to have someone else to bounce the experience off of. I totally agree, especially to watch the different progressions that each of you go through over the following 2 weeks. It's really fascinating and just very helpful.
Right. And, in the group setting, what I find most helpful is you're being seen. People can help you explore what you actually mean because, like you said, we don't have the language innately for this stuff. We've had to develop it over the course of many thousands of years. And a lot of us are just really abstracted from that discussion. We're worried about, TV and 401ks and health.
Yeah.
Not like, the spirit world or whatever it is for you, your psyche.
Yeah. And I think, so I'm just thinking about my experience too, and how even though I had done all this work and I thought I was pretty in touch with myself, but that right after the experience, and actually it's ironic because one of my messages from the trip when I was coming down, one of the very clear messages was, you needed this to ask for help. And because I was at the end of the trip, I was asking for help from the facilitator. And I heard very clearly, like, you needed this to be able to ask for help. And yet when the trip was over, and I even told her that, we like acknowledged it, we talked about it. And then we were all just kind of hanging out during the night. And I was like, I got to go to my room. I got to be alone. I got to get out of here. I have to get into a warm bed. I need to be surrounded by familiar things. And in the morning, I was like, I just want to go home. I want to be around familiar things. And I couldn't be outside of that experience. I couldn't observe it. I was too in it. And I couldn't even communicate it to them. And it took me a while, just a few days later, to be like, oh, wow. Like, I was so overcome with my defense of, I don't know what, one of my core defenses of, I need to be safe. I need to find safety again, that I couldn't even see it because I was too in it. So I think that kind of thing, it's like, how do you get around that? I don't know.
So I'm a strong believer that the research needs to happen. We need to, be spending way more on research, both at the pharma level, university level, et cetera. This is a real crux, right, for expense.
Well, I think the psychosocial level is far more important, actually.
Help me out.
Because we don't have the tools to acknowledge this deep spiritual, emotional thing that happens at the level of, like, when you read Greek myths, for instance, and you actually read what they actually say, and or Hindu mythology. I mean, that stuff, we see it and go, oh, how, well, some people say, oh, how quaint or whatever. But there are traditions that actually take on board its meaning in a way in which we're not trivializing, we're not being afraid of. And we, as Westerners, are profoundly unequipped. We've annihilated that ability from our history, our etymology and so when it does occur, we have no tools, none. And regardless of what's going on in the brain, it's what's going on in us. Can I tell you sort of this anecdote that I
Please.
Coincidentally was told yesterday? It was sort of funny. So a colleague, somebody I'm really fond of, was talking about taking LSD when she was young and with a friend, and they went to a Grateful Dead concert, and she had done plenty of things, but the friend hadn't. And they, took LSD together, and the woman went on this emotional kind of bender, on a psychic kind of bender, and was kind of high for days, and went back home and was trying to tell her brother what had happened, and she just was talking nonsense for days and days and days. And my friend said that, she had later learned and had come to know that the family all have a history. There's a family history of bipolar disorder. And she has spent years, this friend, being convinced that she had, by giving her the drug, precipitated this first event, because now the woman is being treated for bipolar. And my assertion was, whether it's right or wrong, is that this was someone having a serious ontological shock experience that was, not dealt with constructively, because what did you know and what did anybody else around her know? And that's what it was. And I question whether it precipitated her bipolar. The bipolar was obviously already there. There was familial, generational. And it's something I think that can happen. She was kind of relieved. That I said, you need to set that aside. You're not responsible for anything. I mean, other than not knowing that she would have this extraordinary ontologically changing experience that, who knows, in the long run may have in some ways assisted her in other ways. And I just thought that kind of thing can happen. And I don't know, does it precipitate these latent, quote unquote, psychiatric illnesses or neurotic illnesses or psychotic, does it, or I don't know.
What's the alternative though?
Yeah, I don't know. How do you tell? I mean, who knows?
Well, this is the great question. Like we don't have enough data. Yeah. The drug war has put research on the back burner. So like we don't have clear answers because of the drug war. And I would suggest, based on my orientation towards the Groffian perspective, this is, you're really amplifying psychic and mental process and to the point where your psyche just doesn't fit into the, default world very well anymore. And often you need time and or sedatives, tranquilizers to get you back. But the tranquilizers and sedatives could actually cause harm. In my worldview, like the best option is time and really caring support to help these people get through to the other side. Like forced psychiatric hospitalization is a nightmare. It's like very much a last resort. But Mona, what's your perspective here on this, on what Erica just kind of mentioned here, this latent bipolar?
I mean, it is a tough one. I think about it often because I don't know what is didn't some of the old school psychiatrists think that you could use psychedelics for mental illness like that?
Well, exactly. That's what this guy, Gary Fisher, did with these kids.
The legacy literature is chock full of stories like this.
It's amazing.
Schizophrenia, bipolar, et cetera.
Yep.
Primarily, like I think the bulk of the research was schizophrenia because they were, it's such a huge population that has it. And how do we dig in? Go ahead.
They had, I mean, just from reading this, I mean, this is from the early mid 60s. Those definitions, those diagnoses were very, very, I mean, they still kind of are. They're very, very loose.
I'm pretty critical of diagnostic categories.
Yeah, he describes these kids who are clearly kind of all over the map as, psychotic. And obviously some of them have, clear autism. Some of them have clear depression. Some of them are completely shut in. Some of them are self-harming so badly they have to be in straitjackets. So it's really all over the map. And to describe any one of them as schizophrenic or even autistic, he uses those loosely.
Yeah.
Wait, so what did they do in the study?
In this study? Well, it wasn't a study, it was clinical. It was clinical. They were not trying to study this as much as they had kids who were untreatable, who were all housed in the children's ward of a mental hospital. I don't know exactly which one, but it was in the Southern California. And these were kids who had no hope of having normal lives. They were self-harming or other harming. They could not be in schools. They could not be with other kids. They couldn't. And this is what happened. I mean, this is how it was done then. I mean, in many instances, well, okay, now we have the substance. People have talked about it. Let's throw this at them. That was how, I mean, repeatedly, that was how all those numbers came from back then. Nobody was saying, let's do placebo-controlled double-blind, blah, blah, blah.
Well, it wasn't even available at that point, right? Like the double-blind concept came around later, I believe.
Yeah, right. And so they just figured out that they would try it. It was...
Yeah.
And Charlie Grope told me an anecdote about someone also, very depressive guy, been in a mental hospital for months, years, and finally, okay, let's just try it. We've got LSD. Let's give it to him. Also in the 60s. And
so, here's my take on it. I mean, as a neuroscientist, and I spent a lot of time in grad school. Actually, I worked with Ellen Sachs, who's a law professor at USC, who has schizophrenia. She's written a book about it called The Center Cannot Hold. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about mental illness with her and her group. And the problem is that we still don't understand mental illness. So it's hard to answer that question because we have an idea of what psychedelics do. We don't really know how they are affecting the brain. But the bigger problem is we don't really understand mental illness. So it's hard to even answer the question. I mean, I think the solution for now, which is just don't include these people in studies and kind of discourage them from taking these medicines if we don't have the social support for them, I guess is the best we can do. I don't know. But I think the bigger question and more important one is, what the hell is mental illness? Like, what are these, what are these problems? Like, how do they, and I just read a really good book by Gabor Mate, who goes from like A to Z about childhood trauma and our societal problems that contribute to, and his theory is that, I mean, think most people, neuroscientists, a lot of, not psychiatrists, but psychologists, we don't like labels. We don't like the DSM, like especially neuroscience. It doesn't make any sense. All you're doing is clustering symptoms and calling it a disorder. It's useful, but it's not explanatory. So I think we need more people like him, or just, more fields coming together to look at what are the issues. And they're not going to be individual. Like everyone's so focused on, what are the brain mechanisms? But we do need to kind of, pull out and be like, what are the societal mechanisms? How is our society not supporting, or why do we see such an increase in some of these disorders? It's a really big question.
So I have to fact check myself. So the first ever double-blind study was done in 1784.
Oh, wow.
So it just wasn't implemented into modern psychology research until, after all of our, old psychedelic research was executed. And so there's two books here I want to comment on. Thomas Zaz, The Myth of Mental Illness. And from your perspective there, Mona, like that, it seems to really track, because we're kind of making a cluster of behaviors and turning it into a disease just so it can fit neatly into this medical frame.
Yeah.
When it's a little bit far off, like the science is a little broken there. And this gentleman who headed up the commission that put together DSM-5, his name's Alan Francis, a medical doctor. He put together this book called Saving Normal, subtitle, An Insider's Revolt Against Out of Control Psychiatric Diagnosis. DSM-5, Big Pharma and Medicalization of Ordinary Life. So it's something that's well documented. Some people are going to be pissed and call me anti-psychiatry. I just want psychiatry to keep working towards a more science-based approach.
Right.
I'd like to point something out about
Please.
what happened to what the DSM has contributed to our lives since COVID. There was a big move on to get grief made into a pathology that was defined in the DSM, so it could be treated with pill grief. This was during COVID, right? Okay, so now grief is a pathology, and you can be diagnosed with grieving disorder and treated for it.
Yeah, it's like you want to take any human emotion that isn't happiness and classify it.
Anything that does not serve the machine is now considered a disease, a disorder, and has to be fixed, which is unfortunate because it takes us away from every piece of authentic experience that we could ever possibly have. And that is dehumanizing profoundly.
Yeah.
It is kind of like cutting the pieces that make us human. I guess I'm not an expert in psychology, but I've read a few books. But I know that some of the schools of thought talk about like the different parts of yourselves, and it's kind of like our whole society is just like certain parts of us are not acceptable, and we're just like spirituality, no, grief, no. Any kind of mental thinking or disorder, mental disorder, no. But
yeah, who's defining disorder?
Yeah,
you have to read this book, Saving Normal. Honestly, Erica, it'll really show you how the process went of putting together.
I've read it.
Oh, okay. So you get
I wrote. I have a whole chapter. I think Mona's read it about that, the whole DSM process.
Yeah,
and how
right.
just using depression, just SSRIs, I mean, as an example, became, worked into a pathology and how it went through, and that whole, it's a nightmare. It's a nightmare. So
Gabor Mate's, he talks about that. His book is actually called The Myth of Normal, the new book. And he goes into all this too. Just supporting what you're saying.
In defense of psychiatry, briefly, like this is a tool that they needed to standardize their practice across the board. And
at a certain point, yes, the first two editions did exactly that. And then the magic thing that happened, it was a really interesting thing. It was a word change that before it was even called the DSM, in between the first and second, or the second and third edition, they took out the word, these are used to describe reactive disorders of mind and behavior. And they took out the word reactive. So in other words, people were suddenly being made into, you are sick and it's not a response to your world and the things you are experiencing in your world. It was put inside the person.
Right.
And to me, that was like, talk about language signifying, one word, it was eliminated. And this was against it was just amazing. And that's when I can't remember what year I wrote about it. I can't remember what year it happened, but it's
such a good point.
So one of the, can I talk about this Gary Fisher thing? Because
Sure.
I did these just a little bit. I won't go into it at great length. I won't describe the conditions of some of the kids. They're extreme. He did multiple sessions with this small group of kids. He started with 12. He went to 7. They eliminated, and they had a lot of staff there, very big, very, very hands-on support staff, and technical people, nurses, therapists. But one of the things that sort of came out of this was, well, 2 things. He makes the point that there's no way to separate the success of these kids from the fact that they got this caring, very supportive environment. That he said, to separate out the contribution of the drugs from our intense, devoted, caring commitment to these children was not an issue with which we struggled, although it was an issue often raised by other professionals. So he's acutely aware of it. And then the other thing is that he, with some chagrin, notes at the end of this experience, their research was cut off. DEA came in, that's the end of it. Boom, couldn't do it. It wasn't research, their treatment of these kids. Some of the kids were able to go back to school. They were able to interact with other children. Suddenly their IQs were higher because they had been able to relate where they hadn't even. But he makes this point. He says that in the expanded state of awareness achieved by the drug taker, in this case, small children, youngest 5 or 6, the oldest 12, he said, the therapists can't hide from being seen. One's vulnerability is total when sitting with a psychedelic voyager. And he said, we had not anticipated this phenomenon to occur with these children, as they all appeared so disturbed and out of contact with reality. And they were amazed when in sessions they would tease us by mimicking us, sorely hitting our most vulnerable and protected spots. Happily, this was done with compassion and humor and acceptance, but nevertheless, we got the message. We were stunned by the children's perceptiveness and their ability to embrace us in our shame. We had so much and they had so little. So these kids had this capacity for tremendous empathic understanding. And once they were able to come out of their shells, it was clear that they were very gifted in a certain way. And that was amazing. I just found that amazing. That once they could express themselves, they were sophisticated enough and sensitive enough. They were seeing these people for who they were, and they loved them. They had been interacting with them for months, years, and were able to express it. I just thought that was great. So why would we want to get rid of this for small children with terrible, terrible, terrible acute autism? Or so interesting.
There is a resurgence right now in people's willingness to actually look at very young populations. I've been hearing about this from the ketamine space. Say, for instance, a 5-year-old's going through chemo. Pretty traumatic. What if we could give them CAP like a couple times through that process and after? And then they just, that trauma isn't as acute. I think there's a lot here. For one, you say anything about children, it sounds the alarms for everybody, right? I don't totally understand that because I'm not one of these like middle class suburbanites, right? It's a very different lifestyle I lead. But I understand how people would want to protect children all the time as much as possible. But at the same time, are you protecting them by withholding treatment? Doesn't seem right.
I want to also add that, are we protecting children by giving them Ritalin willy-nilly because they're not sitting still in
Right.
school, because all of the gym classes, the
That
music
sounds like
classes,
harm to me.
yeah, and the music classes and all of these other extracurricular classes have been done away with to quote unquote save money. And these poor kids cannot, to ask a small child, a 4-year-old, to sit still, 5, 6, 7-year-old, to sit still for 6 hours. Are you nuts?
Yeah.
I mean, they need to go out and run around. And no, it's a pathology now, right? We're going to diagnose them with ADHD and give them a pill. That to me is abuse.
You probably know the origins of this, right? It's like we needed like in Prussia, there was a need to industrialize and have a uniform workforce. And they pretty much pushed people through a Plato Fun Factory, right? It's like, okay, uniform product, now you can go to the factory. Great. And we're still dealing with a very similar model. And there needs to be many alternative models that the public is paying for. Like, I got by in school. Like, I didn't have great grades. I had a great time because I was fucking off the whole time. But it's not for everybody. And it's a really demoralizing framework and system to be, forcing people through. And, we're expecting really underpaid people to execute well on this poorly imagined system. It's a tough one.
And it's just like, our whole society is not built around humanity, even though we talk a lot about humanity, but there's no humane principles in business or in society. Like, nothing is built around what the human needs. And that's why, like, even in psychiatry, you see these grief or like these normal human needs are pathologized, but they're not. They're just because, we're just cutting off parts of ourselves and not kind of catering to being a human because we hate being human so much. Apparently we hate like the things that are inconvenient about it, that it's like we just have to cut it off and block it off and go forward. But as a result, you can't do that, right? Humans then you have all these coping mechanisms that emerge, and then all these disorders because you're not functioning, in an environment that supports you being what you are. And it's tragic, but obviously the three of us can't solve that here today.
Right. It's, I was just rewinding the tape to the Ritalin topic or Adderall topic.
But it is a larger conversation. I think everyone should be talking about it and thinking about it all the time, because aren't we all sick of it?
Yeah. Like my time there, I could be a lot smarter if I was put in the right situation, having far more impact, right? Or theoretically. And I think most people, if they think about their time in public schools, like even a lot of private schools too, honestly, but it's not, our indoctrination could have been better geared towards serving us.
So I think that I was actually thinking, so bringing it back to our original topic, it actually does relate because, part of what I was thinking about in terms of ontological shock too, is when you encounter something so spiritual, right? Like explicitly spiritual, or like the people who are atheists who have a psychedelic experience and encountered God and come out using language like I, met the sacred, or it was a divine encounter. Like, who uses that language, if you're an atheist? Like, and then when you come out and you've had this shocking experience, you have to deal with it yourself, but then to come out to a society that shuns that kind of, unless it's one certain way. I don't want to call out any one specific religion, but the mainstream one. If it's not in that way, then it's not acceptable. So once again, it's just you've had this experience. It is your experience. It was real. And then especially if it's a psychedelic experience, it was truer than true. It was a realist experience. And then you come out and no, that didn't happen, or no, it wasn't real, or no, I don't want to hear about it, or you literally have no one to talk about it with. And again, it's just brushing under the rug this very human, very, typical experience that people have, and just saying, no, that's not okay. And I think it's all just part of the same problem.
Well, it's also true of, we've talked about this at length, Mona, about being able and not able to share transpersonal experiences. Yeah. I mean, until 2 years ago, really during COVID, when I had a couple, I couldn't share the transpersonal experiences that I've had, starting from when I was very young. And I told Joe about them. I told you about them. And, I've had one since. It actually involved the death of my dog, who I just had to have euthanized Monday. And, you can't talk about it. People go, oh, it's projection and you're just being silly and, sentimentalizing. And so certain dog people understand completely and other people understand completely. But to say to an ordinary person, well, I had this experience in which I actually knew and apprehended that this was the right path and there was no other right path. And no, I can't tell you. No one told me. I didn't sit down and study 1,000 veterinary manuals and have consultations with 10 more vets. And it just is not acceptable. They immediately write you off as a kook.
Yeah, it's really hard. There's a lot of shame around it. It takes a lot of courage, really. It's hard to talk about these things, and you don't know if the person you're telling is going to categorize you as a psycho or if they're suddenly going to tell you a story. But as I found when I was writing my book, I went to talk to a lot of my scientist colleagues and be like, am I nuts? And then each of them told me a story. They all had them. And since then, I've met networks of scientists, physicians, people who work in the medical space, healthcare, or science that are like, we can't talk about these things in public, but we have an email list. We email each other about it. We have a network. We get together and talk about it. It's a safe space. And I've created one of those now too. But now that I'm talking about it, how ridiculous is this? Like, why do we have to have these secret societies to talk about these very typical human experiences? It's, we're just buying into the shame. It's like we're just letting it control us.
Well, the answer in one way is, certainly if you have a certain kind of job that you have to protect your job, they'll fire me because they think I'm nuts. They'll refuse me promotion. They won't fund my grant. Joe and I have talked about this a little bit, what you have to do, cargo cult science, in order to get what funding that you can get to do the research, which is the research that is being funded. And the definitions are so narrow, and then to stray outside of themselves.
Yeah. Well, that's problem number one, is science funding.
Problem number one threatens your career. So who's going to go talk about it?
Oh, no, of course. I understand. Really? But the first problem is science funding, and that it comes from the U.S. government. That's a problem. That should change too. But don't get me started. That's a whole other thing.
Not all of it comes from the government. Private.
The majority of science funding in the U.S. comes from the government, not for psychedelics, obviously, but for everything else. But yeah, no, it's a societal problem. Obviously, it's not like a field problem. And I don't know how to address it other than just coming out and trying to make it okay.
That's the trick. Like, we need to learn from civil rights movement, the gay movement, and probably even Arab Spring, right? We need to stand up and start saying what we think.
Yeah.
And saying what is the most true thing we can say, and it's scary. Like, you are going to have to take career risks if you're in the university and you're trying to get tenure.
Yeah.
Like, maybe you should realize that the university system is kind of a disaster.
Oh, absolutely. And the sad thing is that the people who might punish you for it, again, in secret, they probably also had experiences and agree with you.
Right.
But it's just when you come out in the public space together, then it's not okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a tough one. But yeah, there was actually studies published that if you come out about psychedelic use, you will be taken less seriously as a researcher. So, there are published things about the incentive structures here. It's really scary. Yeah, I've had very few university people I've had on the show come out, but I've had plenty of medical doctors come out, which is really fascinating.
Mm-hmm. I've met a lot of physicians, surprisingly, that, maybe I don't know if it's more acceptable or not in that space, but
it's a good question. I think it's just not like, if you're at a private practice, like, are you really going to get shot down? Like, drug use is endemic. Like it's everywhere. So
Yeah.
like it's not like doctors aren't doing cocaine and ayahuasca, right? It's like it's everywhere.
Yeah. So the case I'm trying to make when I talk about this stuff is that spirituality is actually very healing, as I've come to learn, and very valuable. And I don't care what society says. There are studies behind it, there's proof. It's very healing and it's very valuable to people. And I mean, and this is coming from someone who was so anti that my friends would never talk about anything religious or spiritual in front of me because I was such an asshole. So, I've seen in myself the value, and then also in the studies I've been looking at, in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, they just published something showing like spiritual beliefs and outcomes for chronic illnesses. And I'm sure there's many more like that because, it provides meaning and purpose, which we know, but don't take into account in the medical profession. But we all know that improves, well-being and health outcomes. So I think that there's a case to be made for it in the terms that Western science and medicine likes, which is better health outcomes, right? Saving money. And I guess also in terms of just well-being and flourishing, which people need in everyday life.
All right, so slight technical hiccup there. Mona, you were talking about the value, the kind of proven value of spirituality for well-being. And the thought I had, and I'll let you riff here for a moment. Once I finish this thought, what I have not seen in the psychedelic literature is any kind of bringing in of literature around spirituality. And this idea of a psychedelic experience precipitating a spiritual experience, like there's so much overlap here. And yeah, I don't know. Can you go a little further on the spirituality point?
Yeah, really think, and not only I really think, there's evidence for. I think spirituality is very valuable and very healing. And so I think that like I've seen that personally in my own life, but also I've been trying to find, and I found a few studies looking at spirituality and um, long-term health outcomes, right? And providing meaning and purpose, improving well-being. So I think that if you which I mean, again, I think it's a human desire or a need kind of to have some sort of relationship with spirituality. Um, but if we need to coach it in Western medical and science terms, I think that there can definitely be a case made for how either belief in spirituality, and I do think they're two separate things, belief in spirituality or participation in a community or a spiritual community, because I do think those provide different things that humans need, can improve, health outcomes and well-being. And so, reduce costs, all those things that healthcare and grants love to hear about. So I think that there can be a case made for that. And I think it has just been ignored for a really, really long time. So it's a avenue for research that's ripe for grant money. I mean, it's like a new something we used to know that we abandoned that now we can come back to and incorporate into our models. And yeah, I didn't, my path, as I mentioned earlier, was I came in through an existential crisis, encountering what I call impossible things that shouldn't be happening, paranormal things, whatever you want to call them, um, and moving into spirituality exploration. And then the psychedelics came, and then realizing that they were all related is just really interesting. And that is one of the things, is these questions of if you, for me, as more people undergo these psychedelic experiences, at least the research literature suggests that a relatively high percentage can come out transformed, right? Their worldviews can be flipped. Their belief in something spiritual or a higher power can be transformed. And and then you're coming out into a society that doesn't really support you in that way. So that is one of my questions, is how are we going to address this? And I agree with you. Like, I think that there's, the mystical experience stuff coming out of Hopkins is interesting. And they published a really interesting paper last year about how taking psychedelics increases non-physicalist beliefs, which I thought was really interesting. But I think there should be a lot more of that. And then, as we're discussing, exploration about how to support that best before and after, because it can be hard to find a community, of people who've had similar experiences as you. And if you don't have that, I mean, that's going to be isolating and problematic.
Well, by itself, it kind of creates a kind of, whether we feel that way ourselves or whether other people are telling us, it then starts this self-doubting and pathologizing. Like, there must be something crazy going on here. I wouldn't be feeling this way, and everybody else is not feeling that way,
So this, I would be interested, somebody should do this study, is that asking people who have flipped, did you find support for it? Did you find it difficult? Did you then question your experience? How did the situations and the people around you conflict or support, what you experienced? I think it would be really interesting to know that. And not just interesting, I think it's crucial. So, like, as we think about how to support people when they come out of these experiences, it would be good to have those, that data on hand.
Agreed. Yeah. So I hope some researchers pick this up, start going for it. There are groups that would be willing to research this for sure. And perhaps there are some groups already doing it, right? Like that interface between the psychedelics community and the I hate to use the word community, by the way, rift zone, maybe, but in the consciousness research space, I think there's already a good amount of overlap, but perhaps there could be more. But I know that there's always going to be, you're so niche over here in psychedelic science that how could you even look at this consciousness topic? And I have my doubts around consciousness research generally, but I'm still happy for them to go forward and find some gems for us.
It was interesting. I had a conversation with Roland a couple of months ago, and we were not exactly agreeing to disagree about many points, but there were a few points that overlap, but not. And the essential one came down to, he finally said, okay, well, we just have to accept, that consciousness is something that's unexplainable, but that's the only one. Everything else we can measure. Everything else can be replicated.
I don't think so.
Okay, so consciousness just kind of is. And
Terence McKenna had a really great line ages ago. Any big theory requires a free pass. From creationism to the Big Bang to because you can't. There's a certain threshold.
It.
Right.
There's a certain threshold that you can't go past.
Right. It was. I felt like somebody who was trying to sort of do the self-justification thing for the Big Bang. Well, you just have to accept that that's, you see, because the particles, and we can measure that. I'm like, no, actually, I don't.
Yeah, right. Like, as of right now, we can't explain consciousness. As of right now, there's a number of competing theories. And one thing I would love to see is more collegiality in academia and in our debates. Like, there was a really hateful discussion between the folks at Hopkins and Carhart Harris not that long ago on Twitter. It was like a horrifying series of arguments. And I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm really glad I never got a higher level degree, because I don't want to be dealing with those people ever in that kind of like there's no chance I would want to be in that kind of debate. Like, if we can have a fair, careful debate, great. If you're gonna be a shithead, no way.
My take, actually having, I'm fond of Robin, for various reasons, but and because I know him, I mean, he's one of the people I met very early on, and but he's gone in a very, very techie direction. I mean, he's really gone into that. He really has. He's fundamentally I don't want to say nerd, but he really likes technology. He likes the design and the way things.
He clearly believes he's going to be able to explain it.
Yes,
with machinery and better data, good funding,
and then there's on the other side, there's a lot of defensiveness among some of the Hopkins people about ways of approaching things, and I don't know the ins and outs because actually one of those individuals, blocked me on Twitter a long time ago. I questioned something that he had said, and so
Yeah. I
I
think
sort of
Carhart
stepped
Harris
out
was
of it.
mostly behaved. There's just some other
Yeah,
folks that weren't really
some other
behaving.
folk, yeah, that would have been congruent with
And it's
my.
like this is a clear example of like the cattiness in
Yeah.
academia, and it's
Yes.
Oh yeah.
we could go a lot further together.
Hmm.
That's yeah. Academia is like that. Well, it's filled with a bunch of infantile people who never look at themselves. Anyway, I did just want to comment on I think to their defense, kind of, but it should change. I've been meeting with a lot of neuroscientists, and we've been talking about how you can get so stuck in your silo, right? Like you're so in your analyses, you're so in your
Right.
neuroimaging methods. Like I used to do neuroimaging, so I'm like, we get like obsessed with the new methods, and you have to learn it, and you have no time, and there's all this stuff, so you get so in your field that you can't look outside, and nobody rewards you for looking outside, right? Like we talked about, like the funding doesn't, unless you apply for an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary grant, they don't care if you talk to other people. Like they actually just want you, they only want your neuroscience in that application. But I think that's a huge problem. And I think that that's what keeps all these fields siloed and separated, and that we can't come together to think of bigger issues. And when I held this neuroscience and spirituality social at the biggest neuroscience conference in November. It's for Society for Neuroscience, and I thought no one was going to show up. We had a bunch of scientists show up, and you know I would hear this argument, and I kept pushing back because we would start talking about spirituality, consciousness, da da da, and somebody would pipe up and say, "Well, that's philosophy. That's not our job." And it's like, I get it. That's not your job, but are you trying to solve a problem in nature? Are you trying to understand the nature of the brain and reality? Then philosophy is your business. Okay. You may not have to include it in your grant, but you should know it and be familiar with it, and don't dismiss it. You need to incorporate it, because what if consciousness doesn't come from the brain? Then what did you spend your whole career doing? What if a thought from philosophy could have helped you? So I think that's a huge problem in neuroscience. And I always encourage neuroscientists to please, for the love of God, read something other than neuroscience. Psychiatry, psychology, philosophy, history.
Right.
I
And
think it's very
we
strange that we think that consciousness comes from the brain. I think it's entirely bizarre, actually. And this whole, who was it who was putting forth this notion? I can't remember where I read it now, Mona, you know.
Mm-hmm.
That it's kind of that the mind is rather a radio receptor for the things that are presented in this universe that is the consciousness, and we have a receiver here.
Yeah, well, I
We're
mean, William
psycho.
James thought, or
Yeah.
Aldous Huxley filtered.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm actually seeing some papers in peer-reviewed science journals, new models of consciousness coming out, theories about how consciousness could be a field that interacts with our biological system and filters in. So we're starting to see some of that in actual scientific papers, which I was really shocked, but encouraged to hear, because we don't know, and it doesn't make sense to say for certain, or to only explore, or only fund one view. If this is a real problem we're trying to solve, we should be tackling it from every angle, right? Sorry to cut you off, Erica. Did you want to?
It's okay. Yeah, it's fine.
I want to keep going further, but I think I need to wrap. But let's do this again. This is really good, and I think this philosophy topic, pairing it with neuroscience and like other things that are under discussed, is really important. So I would love to keep this conversation going with you both. Before we close, would you like to mention anything you're up to?
Well, as I mentioned probably a few times, I'm working with a collaborator, and we're putting together some retreats and some other meetings for neuroscientists or any kind of scientist that is curious about anomalous phenomena or transpersonal stuff or consciousness or psychedelics or anything they don't feel comfortable talking about with a fellow scientist. We're trying to make a safe space for them to come and explore these topics.
Beautiful, beautiful. And we'll have some links for that, hopefully. in the show notes. So send those over. And Erica, how about yourself?
Well, I've been so preoccupied by, my life changes that it's been hard to focus on very much. But one avenue I am starting to explore that's very interesting to me, and part of the reason I'm going to this McKenna event is that I think that we ignore or destroy the intelligence of both plants but other species at our very grave peril. And I mean, this dovetails with my uh, reporting when I was, doing climate science reporting, but certainly with the feelings I've always had about the natural world from long, long, long before I did anything psychedelic. I was looking, this is going to sound very silly, but I was walking this morning, I was walking my dog, and there was a stump. And on the stump, because it's now getting a little bit warmer, there were lichens and mosses growing up. And I could count just on this one silly little stump over 24 individual species on this silly stump in this little place in the Catskills, that's been degraded and deforested and whatever. And I'm just happen to be here right now. And some of those lichens are, when they open up, they're shaped like a little cup. And I collected those as a child. Whenever I found them, I would take large lumps of them and bring them home in a plastic bag. And, generally they'd spill and chaos would ensue. But I just thought, how does that thing know to be in a cup? And why is it a little cup? And the other ones are shaped like something else. They're flat. Is it in a cup because it wants to capture the rain? And what happens when certain species, and I'm not just talking about sentinel species, like I don't know, certain kinds of higher mammals or certain plant species. What happens when these little niche species that only exist in one waterfall ecosystem go away? What are we losing?
Yeah,
And
a lot.
but I'm not only losing something in the world and in principle, but I think we're losing something in our brain. I think we're losing something in our ability to function on the planet, that it somehow matters, that our ecosystem, our world is living and animate, and all the eyes used to watch us, and those eyes in the trees are not watching us anymore. Because what happens? I think something is going to happen, and I think we should pay attention to that.
Throw out a hippie book recommendation, Ecotopia. It's a little dated, but worth checking out conceptually at least. But all right, well, thank you both. Definitely need a break, but can't wait to have you back.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, you got it.
Feel better.